From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Andrew Robb. I'm section head for special format conservation here at the library, and I'm filling in for our chief, Elmer Usman, who couldn't be here this afternoon. He sends his regrets. But let me introduce our speaker for the 79th lecture in our Topics in Preservation series. Paul Messier is our speaker, and his innovations in the field of conservation are noteworthy. Pioneering work in surveys of photograph collections, the development of a target for imaging of ultraviolet fluorescence, the formation of a reference collection of photographic papers, and a related project regarding the development of the texture scope, topics that Paul discussed here in 2010 and are available on our series of webcasts on the preservation website. Along with these accomplishments, for many years, Paul was principal of the successful photographic conservation practice Paul Messier, LLC, specializing in the treatment and characterization of 19th and 20th century photography, especially the characterization of the photographs of Louis Hine and Man Ray. I'd also say that along with his work in that practice, he's trained a number of people, many of whom are here and on the webcast, and I know they're all appreciative of his efforts in that regard too. While this practice is still strong and ongoing, in 2015, Paul was appointed head of the Lens Media Lab, a startup that is part of the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage at Yale University. His talk today, Expressive Dimensions of Photographic Papers, is another chapter of Paul's work to better understand the materials used by photographers so that we can better interpret them and care for them. Paul Messier.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for showing up. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces. It's great. Great to be here. So let's get started. Okay, without any fooling around. This is one of my favorite things in the world. This is a Garret sample book of photographic papers from the mid-1930s. I'm just going to play around with this a little bit. And you get a sense of why this is just so cool. You know, and when you look at this, it's just like unnecessary greatness. You know, like, I mean, how many surfaces is that? 38? 36? No. Well, I can't count right now. Somebody can do 4 times 9 minus 2. 7? No, it's not an odd number. 34. Okay, class dismissed. Let's go. I'm done. Yeah, okay, that's very good, Andrew. So, yeah, I mean, why does any company need so many surfaces of black and white paper? What's going on here? And I think, you know, the black and white medium that we have received in the 21st century, what's left of it, is this kind of dim echo of this amazing diversity that existed for much of the century. And you know, this is sort of a microcosm of what was available. This is one company's paper selection for 1 year. If you multiply this by 5 or 8, you know, international companies, big corporations like Kodak and Ilford and Agfa, and many other smaller companies, you get a sense of how rich the medium of black and white, silver gelatin, whatever you want to call it, photography is. And it became important to me to try to catalog this, to try to understand this diversity and try to understand what was going on, what was promoting this. Why did they need so many surfaces? What did that represent? And one of the ways that I settled on in terms of trying to get a handle on all of this is just really looking closely at a package of paper. And on the package of paper is pretty much all you really need to know about one aspect of characterization, one aspect of how to characterize a photographic paper. And let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah, okay. So what we're looking at here is basically 4 dimensions that the manufacturers were trying to convey to photographers and that photographers were fluent in at the time. So here are the 4 dimensions. What's the base color? What color is the base? In this instance, it's ivory white. What's the texture and what's the gloss? Here we have one word, percale, which refers to both texture and gloss. If you know percale, it's a fabric. It's a tightly woven, I think, cotton fabric with sort of a satiny, lustery finish. So both a texture and a gloss. And then what's the base? What's the support? How thick is it really? I mean, that's basically all that is. How much of an assertive physical presence does the material have? And so this is a kind of a carton. It's a thicker support. So here we have the 4 dimensions that, as I say, there was a real fluency in these 4 dimensions that I think we don't actually perceive so much anymore in terms of contemporary black and white papers. Did a project in 2012 at the Museum of Modern Art, my research was really focused on, well, can I make those 4 dimensions relevant in a contemporary context? Are they useful for anything when it comes to classification, characterization of photographic materials? And so this is one of the prints that I was looking at, was this Helmar Lursky in the MoMA collection. And so here are the 4 dimensions, and the first 3 are actually really pretty easy to measure. Thickness, well, you just get a micrometer. Gloss, you get a gloss meter. And this is all pretty conventional stuff. Color, a spectrophotometer. And what I'm measuring and what I'm representing here is just how yellow it is. How far along on this B axis in the LAB color space is it? So it's 5.7. Okay, great. Texture was a problem, and we convened a group of signal processing engineers, and we asked them to look at texture images to try to back out some numbers to help us classify paper texture. And so we settled on a method that kind of centered on a 2-dimensional raking light image of the surface of a photographic paper, represented here as about 6.5 millimeters square. And so we took images like this, and we had 4 different signal processing teams, and they came up with 4 different algorithms for classifying these kind of images. One of them does what I would do if I knew anything about signal processing. I mean, the difference is mine is in my head and theirs actually works. It's based on using the brightness of the pixels as a proxy for height. So the brighter the pixel, the higher the surface, the darker the pixel, the lower the surface. And when you do that, you can conceive of an image, a 2-dimensional image, in really a 3-dimensional way. And this is all false and rendered, but you see what's going on here. So you can take that pseudo topography, let's call it, and then you can start breaking it down and backing out some numbers. And now we have these fractals. We've basically cast a net over our surface, and we have different mesh dimensions. We can cast a really wide net or a really narrow net, and that becomes a classification scheme. So we can back out some numbers now. So this is amazing. Just wait for it. Texture. Okay. Yes. I mean, wait a minute. I mean, 4.9 scale 1 pseudo area scale fractal analysis. Okay, I know what a millimeter is, and I kind of can see what a gloss unit is, although that's pretty abstract. But I'm not, so these numbers, while they're important, they're non-intuitive. It doesn't convey the information that I really needed to convey. So I started to think about how we can put those numbers into context. And as some of you may know, I've been obsessively collecting photographic papers for a long time. And I have like around 6,000. And I was so glad to see Lauren here, because Lauren Varga was in my studio at the start of this collecting, and she did a lot of the initial cataloging on this collection. And this collection has come with me to Yale, and it's really the foundation of the work, at least in the initial phases of the Lens Media Lab. So let's just call this the genome. And so let's put those numbers into context of the genome. How can we, what do we learn when we compare the numbers for a particular print to the 6,000 or so photographic papers? That gives us the context that we need. And so we can take this, well, here's an example of that. And this is like a really easy example to understand, I think. There's a few thousand thickness measurements here from the collection. And you can see, it's intrinsically valuable information. I mean, you can see, this breakout of single weight papers, how single weight was actually thinner before 1930, and then it got a little thicker after 1930. Double weight, you can see the range of double weight. You can see after 1980, when the industry is sort of beginning to collapse and consolidate, you see a collapsing, a consolidation of single and double weight into this sort of mushy medium weight kind of thing. Okay, that's interesting in and of itself. But if you put the Lursky in here, which measures at about 0.17 or so millimeters thick, you can see it's right in the heart of single weight papers. But you can also kind of intuitively see that, there's about 15% papers that are thinner and about 85% papers that are thicker. And so using that, as a strategy, we can put these numbers into a better context. We can replace all of that with just really kind of simple visualizations. And that's just based on a percentile. So for the Lursky, like I said, about 15% of papers are thinner, so that's the 15%. About 85% are thicker. Gloss, it's a pretty matte paper. There's a lot of papers that are glossier. Color, it's right in the middle between kind of neutral, like bluish white, and warm white. It's right, splits the difference. And texture, it's got a lot of texture. All right, well, that's great. So, how can we really use this information? How can we better use this information? And I'm all about, trying to visualize these things as intuitively as possible. And so this is a step in the direction. If you have any great ideas about how to visualize this data and make it more accessible, I would love to hear it. So I arranged those 4 axes like this, and I put kind of the more expressive dimensions, the rougher papers, the thicker papers, the more matte papers, the more warm papers. I've oriented them to the outside of this kind of what's going to become this glyph. Here's the Lursky data plotted, and I want to clean it up a little bit. And that. And so that is my, it's a glyph. It's a thumbprint that stands in for the material characteristics of this photographic paper. And so it gives me a really quick visual reference of not what this image is, but what this material is. And so, okay, so how do you use that? How can that be useful to us? I think we're going to go back to my favorite thing, and we're going to look at 2 papers. This is called Large X. I think that's right. And this is called Glyphs Velour. And so Large X on the left and Glyphs Velour on the right. And you can see Glyphs is plotted in this sort of glyph right at the edges of the universe of expressive possibilities. It's got more texture, it's thicker, it's more matte, it's warmer than any of the most of the papers, by far most of the papers in the collection that I've measured. And this was a deluxe paper. This was a paper designed for highly expressive, self-realized photographic artists. It was incredibly expensive. It was the most, and they were proud of it. It's the most expensive photographic paper of the time. They called it the most beautiful photographic paper. No, they called it the most beautiful paper ever manufactured. Didn't call it the most beautiful photographic paper, the most beautiful paper ever manufactured. It was sold in very few contrast grades. You had to know what you were doing. You had to have a good negative to print with this. On the other hand, large X, which occupies the sort of inside of this universe of possibilities, this is, the faster they come, the better you'll like it. What they're talking about is photo finishing. This is a paper made for commercial photo finishers. It's the ideal rapid photo finishing paper. This was sold, yes, you could buy sheets, but more commonly you would buy rolls of this stuff. It was about 5 times less expensive than Glyphs. And so what you have here is this, the two ends of the spectrum for that particular year of Glyphs paper, of Garret papers. This for one segment of the market and for one very specific sort of expressive intent, and this on the opposite. And I like to think about numbers, I guess, but I also like to think about words and semantic meaning. And so here are the two papers side by side, two advertisements from the period, and I'm just going to overlay some words. And these words, I think, convey the meaning of the inside of that glyph, the small, when that glyph is really small and tight and centered in the focus, you're talking about an object that speaks objectively. It's a document. It's real, and you can compare like this list of words. I like some of these things. It's cerebral. And I made all this up, by the way. And this is not like any sort of orthodoxy here. I mean, you can make up your own. So objective, for objective purposes, to convey information, versus subjective, to convey a high level of discernment. This is for straight photography. This is more skewed. This is functional. This is indulgent. This is utilitarian. This is art. And you can kind of actually, when you think about expressive dimensions of photographic paper, you can actually think about expressive dimensions of like a chair. I think, I could go to work for IKEA now with this and put like this into their catalog. Like, where do you fall on the expressive versus functional dimension, for this chair or this picture or whatever. This is very functional, utilitarian. It's straight. It's not skewed. It's utilitarian. It's not art. I don't know about cerebral. Anyway, so you get the point, right? I just happened to be running around yesterday and came upon Capy Mintys' project here. And she's got this great project, and she's working with Adrian Lundgren on it, to look at technical manuals and catalog photographs, actual photographs that get put into these manuals. And it's an amazing project, and it just explodes the idea of, it really renders very clear how diverse the medium is, and how, you think of these categories of prints, an albumin print, a platinum print, and yes, that's really a good basis for understanding the medium, but you don't know anything until you've seen this amazing, real-time invention of these different processes. Anyway, so this caught my eye, and what texture, tint, texture, surface combination do you prefer? And so it's, I kind of did make some of this stuff up, but a lot of it really comes right straight out of the vocabulary, the language of the medium. And I love this. At different times for different jobs, your preference may run to this base, this texture, that gloss, this gloss. Shuffle and reshuffle these characteristics into every desirable combination, add in First, okay, blah, blah, okay, and then it's really great, range. So, these things worked in combination for very specific purposes and intentions that photographers were trying to convey. And the manufacturers knew it, and the photographers knew it. Just back to this project at MoMA for a second. How can we, the idea here is to characterize papers, yes. But to what end? And I'm always trying to think of, well, what is sort of the utilitarian end of kind of this work? And so this was one proof of concept that we were working on. Here are MoMA prints on the left column. So these are MoMA prints, and they're both to scale. On the right is our prints at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And what I was doing is comparing across these collections, the materials of the photographer across these two different collections. And the prints were never side by side. We just went and we measured the 4 expressive dimensions to see if we could get some information out. And so here's the Lursky again on the left, and here's its glyph, its thumbprint, and on the right is the MFA Lursky. And we see, based on the measurements, that it's very similar in terms of gloss, for sure, and it's similar in terms of base color, but it's got a much smoother texture, and it's actually really a thick paper. So who knows? We don't know if maybe they were made at different times, but what we do know is that the materials are fundamentally different across these two identical looking images. Same with this. I mean, it's very different conception from that negative, very different composition from that negative, and fundamentally a very different paper. And this one is kind of the opposite case. It's very different in terms of its composition, its conception, but on an identical photographic paper. So maybe these two share a provenance. So again, if you know the provenance of one of these, maybe you can actually, when it was made, how it was made, why it was made, maybe you can actually apply it to this object as well. So this starts to open up, some other avenues of scholarship when it comes to understanding and contextualizing photographic papers, or photographs, not just photographic papers, photographs. That's what I'm talking about. We're doing a great project now on Moholy photograms with my friends and colleagues at the Art Institute, Sylvie Pénichon and Krista Lowe. And so we're looking at about 250 photograms in different collections. I think that's the right number. And, it's really fascinating in terms of potential when you go from this to this. These are all the different glyphs for the collection. And, if you're like me, you want to start sorting these right away. Let's figure out what's the same ones, what's the different ones, what's going on. And so that's the next, when I come back here in 4 years, the last talk I gave here was 4 years ago, I think. I'll have some statistical methods and some visualization tools to actually sort this out. In fact, I hope to have the statistics, the ways to model this statistically figured out really soon. That's kind of the next step on this work, is how do these things cluster, and what does that tell us about Moholy's approach at different time periods of his career, if anything. I think it will actually reveal a lot. And so the expressive dimensions, I'm talking about these 4 expressive dimensions. And I think, of course, there are many more. You can add different axes to that glyph, depending on what you need. Here's a proposed, additional axis, perhaps. We went back. This was work that Jennifer McGlinchey, who was in my studio for a number of years did. And she just went back to the collection and a lot of manufacturer sample books and price lists and encyclopedias, and just pulled out what dimensions photographic paper was sold in. And there's a huge diversity of dimensions, big, small, all over the place. But if you boil it all down, it comes out, I think this adds up to, what does this add up to? 50, back to math. Andrew? I'm calling like that. 50, what is this? 39 plus 50 is 89. Okay, if you, almost 90% of the things that we looked at boil down to these 5 different aspect ratios, which I think is just fascinating. I mean, I don't know what this tells us about humans and aesthetics and all of that, but it's amazing that the 4:3 ratio was used as a whole plate daguerreotype, but also for the iPad. I mean, Steve Jobs could have made the iPad any dimensions he wanted to, but why did he do 4:3? And how did that work? Maybe because he watched a lot of TV or something. I don't know, because it was early TV as well, was the 4:3 dimension. Who knows? But we can put this information to work as well in terms of interpreting photography or photographs or photographers. Here's an example. On the left, again, these are to scale. On the left is a Man Ray rayograph from 1924. On the right, a Moholy from around the same period. Just measure it. And I measured a bunch. I've probably measured, I'm not sure now, maybe 40, 30 Man Ray rayographs. And about 44% come out to these standard sizes. Okay, whatever. But if you look at Moholy, about 90% are these standard sizes. And so they're both making photograms around the same period, but right away we can see instantly from this very simple metric their methodologies and their intentions were incredibly different. Moholy is composing to the sheet. Photograms are really a performance piece, right? You're placing objects, you're putting on the light, and it's a record of that performance. For Moholy, the performance is finished when it goes into the developer and the print is dry. That's it. For Man Ray, most of the time, the final part of the performance is he's trimming the print. And we know this because they're not standard sizes. They don't fit into these standard sizes, these standard aspect ratios. And so Man Ray is trimming. He's refining that vision. He's making a refinement to that performance as his last, before he is finished. I get some criticism, I don't know, maybe it's just all in my head. Sometimes I have, a lot of things are that way, somewhat paranoid. I have some trouble talking to curators about this at times because they think, I don't know, maybe I'm misreading the situation, but they're thinking that this is just really a formalist exercise where it's devoid of context. And what I'm trying to say here is it's all about context. If I don't have the universe to compare the measurements to, then the measurements mean very little. The measurements are always in comparison to a larger body, so of numbers that represent the medium. So to me, it's all about context. But I think I can maybe make that point better talking about a project that I'm working on at the Guggenheim right now, looking at Mapplethorpe prints. And we're specifically looking at the prints, the platinum palladium prints made in the later years of his life. This is one of those prints made in 1988. Mapplethorpe dies in 89. He's diagnosed with AIDS in 86. And if you didn't know that context, you could perceive something is up just by looking at this data, okay? And so here's that Mapplethorpe print. And all this really is every print that we've looked at going horizontally, and then the same prints going vertically. And so we're comparing each the texture of each print to each other. And that's what this little chart is all about. But you don't need to know exactly what's going on here, except what you do need to notice, or what I would like you to notice, is we've got two really distinct clusters. And so the prints themselves are giving you context. The measurements made from the prints themselves surface something is going on in 1986, this break point here. And, you know, what's happening, and I've got the data to support it, and I can talk more about it, you know, question and answer, but, you know, he's making actually substantially more expressive photographs after 1986. And so the interpretation, I think many interpretations could be supported here. But of course, if you combine that with the image and the fact that it's platinum and palladium, very permanent, noble metals, you know, he's thinking about legacy, you know, this formal frontal composition. But yeah, but look at the paper with this wild decal edge. The paper, I'm sure Mapplethorpe had no idea, but the paper is about, if I get it right, it's like 85% cotton, about 15% linen. It's made by the Arshes mill, one of the oldest mills, founded in 1492, as a matter of fact. Funny how I can remember that. It's incredibly traditional paper. It's got this amazing texture. It's back to the fibers for a second. I didn't finish that point. That fiber composition is more of a traditional fiber composition of a sheet made in the 18th, 17th century. You know, I think it's got more, this print has probably more in common with, you know, a Dürer than a Stieglitz. And it goes beyond the possibilities of silver gelatin. It's way beyond. So he's pushing past all of that. And to me, I think that's profound. I think that's incredibly useful information, to be able to document that and to actually be able to effectively communicate that and to share that, which is what this characterization agenda is really all about, is giving us tools to communicate the intrinsic value of the materials of the photographer. And so that's all I have, and I would love to take some questions, and thanks for your attention. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Please.
Being interested in terminology and tone, paper tone is something I've been thinking about a lot, and how you describe paper tone and how you measure paper tone, and I'm curious about your ideas about how aging and yellowing influences
Brilliant.
that and how that affects your classification.
So, yeah, okay. So I'm repeating the question for, because it's webcast, right? Yeah, okay. So let me see if I got the summary right. So when paper ages, it yellows. And so how does that impact the classification scheme? And that's a really good question. And, you know, questions like that used to bother me a lot, because it was like, that wrecks everything, you know, because we never know, like, what it was originally, and now it's this, and But now I just sort of go with it, because there's nothing I can do about it, but B, I think it's information, and I think it's fascinating to think about photographs, and we all know this, becoming more expressive as they age. I mean, sometimes they don't age in an expressive way, but as a Stieglitz, as a Madadi gains tone, gains some paper tone, it becomes this more expressive object. And so I just try not to get in the way of that. And I just try to document that. But yeah, I mean, I could really dwell on that, and it could be a real conceptual flaw. If you think about gloss is also one of those dimensions that can change for a photographic paper, especially depending on treatment. Treatment completely alters the color as well. But you know, texture, we've done some experiments, and texture really seems to hold up and is pretty robust. And thickness really holds up too over time. That's pretty robust. And so when it comes to the sort of the statistical analysis of all of these glyphs, I'm thinking of making kind of set points for things that don't tend to move. So and giving them additional weight in the in any sort of future statistical model. Does that make sense? Those become sort of the keystones when it comes to that are first considered for clustering. Yeah. Please.
Talk about looking at paper in the photographic context in comparison, say, with intaglio and other kinds of printmaking. Are there similar analyses or descriptions that are out there?
So the question is, are there similar characterization models set up for other printmaking media, like intaglio prints, lithographs, and all of that? I mean, not that I know of, but I mean, after today, I'm inviting everyone out there to like go back and think about, your media, and maybe think about it in terms of expressive dimensions. I think that model could work. I gave this talk, or a version of this talk, at the Rijksmuseum last year, and a paintings conservator came up to me afterwards and said, panel paintings. I think this will work great on panel paintings. And frankly, I have no idea how you would make that work on panel paintings. But she did, and I think that's awesome. I think, like I said, I think you could do it for, IKEA chairs. I think you could do it for all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, it would make a lot of sense to start looking at printmaking, traditional printmaking media. And actually, that's kind of something that is very interesting to me, is putting photography in a larger context of, photography didn't come out of the ether. Photography is a graphic arts medium, and putting it into context with more traditional printmaking media is a very appealing notion. Please, yeah.
I really appreciate how you've applied the systems thinking to the analysis of the characteristics of the papers and photographs. I actually have come up with a characterization scheme for Italian chiaroscuro woodcuts.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
I've been surveying large numbers of them in international collections. But my question is, so when you have characterized these artists' prints, do you find in their writings that their writing actually corroborates your aesthetic interpretation from the data that you've been able to derive from your analyses?
Okay, so the question is there documentary evidence within an artist's journals or writings that, tell me if I'm right here, that correlate with the interpretation or the characterization scheme that I'm coming up with? And the short answer to that is I don't know. I've not really gone down that road, and I think that's actually a really important thing to do. Actually, yeah, it gives me some ideas. Actually, yeah, that would be a valuable thing. Is that something that you've been able to do? Like, compare what an artist is saying about their work and what you're finding?
With regard to the printmakers who made chiaroscuro woodcuts, they didn't really right about their aesthetics. There are a couple sources that that talk about how to make a chiaroscuro woodcut, but in terms of the finer characteristics and differentiation of specific workshops and their outputs, no, at that time during the
Yeah.
Renaissance,
It's not a lot of,
the Renaissance art form,
yeah.
they weren't writing
that.
about their aesthetic intent
Yeah.
in that way.
Can I,
Unfortunately, no, but.
yeah.
But I was just wondering if there is a alignment between your.
I'm sure there's a line where it lines up in some instances and supports everything I'm doing, and I'm sure that there's like a lot that contradict it entirely, you know, if I started looking. I'm sure it doesn't, it's probably not as tidy a scenario, you know. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I don't know if this goes to your point, but, you know, I'm talking about papers here, and I'm not really, so I guess let's see, what am I trying to say? I mean, you can make an expressive photograph on a non-expressive paper. You know what I mean? And so that can be part of the artistic intent as well. So I'm thinking like of a brassai. A brassai, I saw a beautiful brassai at the Art Institute last week. It's you know, you can lose yourself in the deep, inky, amazing blacks of a brassai. And he's photographing Paris at night primarily. And he's using a very non-expressive paper in a very expressive way. And it's highly ferrotyped. The optical saturation of those blacks is amazing. They're thin, you know. It kind of reveals the conceit of a surrealist or a Dadaist, well, surrealist primarily, photograph. The conceit is they're using a non-expressive paper to convey information, but it's of a skewed reality. If they used an expressive paper, it would be too interpretive, and it would be useless. But what's communicated by the paper is this is information, subliminal. You know, this is information. This is the real world, and it's the dream world. So, you know, I think a lot about those kind of things, and I probably should start integrating more. To round that out, start integrating more about what photographers are thinking and saying and talking about their work.
I think it would be, again, it's a really fascinating branch of your study, but your work is just absolutely fun. It has implications for all kinds of graphic work and analyzing all kinds of graphic work.
Great, and not just IKEA chairs. Yeah.
It's just a comment to follow up on Linda's.
Okay.
It's just to say, I think photographers often are describing papers that they like, or they're sad that they don't have that paper anymore. They, you know, often in their writings, what they'll say.
Yeah,
to
yeah.
Linda's point is that it's like, oh, I really like this paper, but I can't get it anymore. And what you're doing in a way is figuring out a way to objectify that description. So when they say that,
Yeah.
what do they mean? And so this is a model to say, well, they're sad about this kind of paper, which is very hard to know exactly what they're talking about. You kind of know a little bit, but this is a way to make that, put it in a context. To say, well, why are they sad? Why do they like that? Where does that paper, so that's the tying back. That's a way that often they're doing that in many cases, is that it's an aside. It's not, you know, a tome, but this is a way to unravel what they're getting at. And would be, I think that would be, you would find examples of that. They, you know, in the way that correspondents and photographers had in articles that they write, but it might be in a more shorthand way. It might not be in using that terminology, but I still think that would exist. It does exist.
Yeah. Excellent. So please, we'll go left to right. Okay. Or my left.
Follow up on Andrew's question. So about your paper library, have you been, collecting? I know that a lot of papers recently have it's sped up in the last 5 to 10 years where they're just canceling and papers are no longer available. So have you been kind of collecting samples of these to add to your library so that you have that as, a dictionary, for lack of a better word, or
Yeah.
catalog for future scholarships. So say artists, practicing now or within the last 20 years, in 50 years, when we go back and look at their work, so that we have a standard to compare them to.
Yeah. So the question, to summarize, is am I collecting contemporary black and white materials within the context of the gradual disappearance of the medium, I guess. Is that a fair summary, something like that? And the answer is yes. But it's really, yeah, I mean, the answer is yes, but I'm not getting everything, and it's kind of frustrating. And one of the projects that I would really like to do is to figure out a way to make the catalog and the collection much more accessible, in hopes of surfacing other collections, and maybe sending the message out that, hey, there's a crazy guy up at Yale who will take this stuff. Don't throw it away, when you're going. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of frustrating because it is just slipping through our fingers. But I mean, the fundamental purpose of the collection always was, yes, to make a data set. I've never had like sort of antiquarian sort of interests, but then it started to grow on me, and so now I really do feel like maybe in the end, my biggest contribution is not any of this stuff. It's just buying a lot of stuff on eBay and cataloging it and sticking it in cold storage at a major research university,
It kind of seems like a natural match with, archivists and librarians to kind of maybe reach out to some of them and say, hey, you work with your department at, your school, your university, or you work with this group of artists. As you see them transition more and more, do you have this, and to figure out some way of collaborating on that? I don't know what it would be or how that would work, but it seems like that would be an amazing thing.
Yeah, and so just to summarize that comment, I think that's an important one, well, I don't know, I'm not summarizing your comment. I'm making a comment to your comment, which is, absolutely building a network to collaborate and to share this kind of information. I mean, think about it, and that's kind of one of my visions and one of my ambitions for the Lens Media Lab, is to make not just these glyphs available or these statistical methods, to make really an interface, to put it all online and to link different collections together. And so when you have a print that you want to know more about, that you can at least make a query about what other materials are out there like this across different artists within different time periods. Imagine what an amazing and fairly simple tool to enhance existing scholarship that would be. And what's great about that for me as a conservator is it really pushes forward the relevance of materials, which sometimes get lost in the mix when it comes to interpreting photographs. Sorry, yeah.
To follow up on, or amplify what Linda and Andrew were bringing up as well, I was reading a book just recently. It's about the art of the book in Europe, 1939 through 49, something like that. It's published in 1951, but the sentiment in it is still very real about the politics of choice and reviewing what was able to be done in the face of incredible destruction, availability of materials and machines and factories destroyed. So I think for another useful layer, this is a comment, of course, not really a question, but another useful layer is the transition of the person, the maker, and where they were in time, what they could do. Were they hoarding? Were they sending materials to somewhere that they could retrieve? And I'm always impressed that you always state the negative date.
Yeah.
Date,
Yeah.
Because we have to tease that out.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it is all, oh, sorry, Mary.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I can go? talk more?
You can repeat some of the points.
I can. So context, I think, was the underlying point there, and understanding context, historical context in this instance, and talking about, you know, the incredible destruction about to be unleashed on Europe in the 30s, and how that influenced choice. And you know, you see that very clearly if you look at Man Ray. I think, you know, in the teens. You know, he, I think, is a brilliant artist, but he couldn't make a pictorialist photograph to save his life, and he didn't want to because it wasn't relevant to him. You know, after World War I and Dada, you know, as a Dadaist, you couldn't make a beautiful. It didn't seem relevant. It didn't seem. It had to be manufactured. It had to look objective. It had to, you know, back to my synonyms and antonyms, it had to be real. It couldn't be arty or interpreted. It didn't make sense in that context anymore after the First World War. So, you know, it's all in there, right?
There's a question.
There's a question
Yeah.
for online?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Have you considered how image material affects texture with platinum prints?
Have I considered whether image material impacts texture when it comes to platinum prints? So image material, I'm guessing, would be the platinum or the palladium. That's the stuff that's making the image, and how that impacts texture. I think the fair answer is no. I think this person has something in mind that I don't have in mind. And I probably should have in mind, to be honest. Because, yeah, I mean, all these things combine, right? I mean, to look at something in exclusion is probably a little artificial on my part. Is there a follow-up? Like, he missed the point?
No, I'm looking.
Like,
I'm looking, but there's another question. You want me to go with-
yeah, sure, another,
question is,
sure.
Could you speak a bit more about process for measuring each algorithm? Are texture measurements taken from recto and verso, given that image could mute texture?
Image can mute texture. Okay, so, yeah, I mean, okay, so what I've presented is kind of a condensed version of what I'm often doing. And so I do make texture measurements from recto and verso often when I can get access to the verso. Often you cannot. Again, I'm thinking about statistic-based classification schemes, even though it doesn't exist right now, and hopefully it will. Hopefully I'll be able to build it. More information in the more information for the statistical models to chew on is probably better right now. But you know, what I'm really thinking about mostly, and what I'm really focused on mostly, is artistic intention. And I'm really thinking about characteristics that artists and we all in this room can see and perceive. So, you know, while having more information is always better, I'm really focused on perceptual qualities, if that makes any sense at all.
I'll tell you if there's a follow-up.
Okay. Well, I've just broken the internet. Is there any other questions? Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually going back to as we were talking about perceptual qualities, I was thinking about how these clips could be very useful, especially when you're looking at images online. When you're looking
Yeah.
at digital reproduction.
Absolutely.
You can't actually be there to see these kinds of textural characteristics. And
Absolutely.
How, now people do a lot of research that way. If you can't immediately have access to an original,
Absolutely.
that's extremely valuable.
Yeah. I hope Google is listening, because yeah, I mean that's actually, I mean, so the question, the comment was how, if you're doing online access, online research, you're doing research online, you're presented with an image, but you have almost no information about the material and how these little glyphs if it became kind of a convention, would really help tremendously and very simply communicate some essential physical properties. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part of the agenda, is to kind of maybe try to, develop this so it becomes really conventional. And so when you're cataloging a collection, and by the way, the other part, when it comes to like, are you doing the back, are you doing the front, are you doing the image, are you doing all of that? Yes, and I understand in many instances why that's valuable. But to be honest, really, I'm all about high levels of throughput. I want a lot of data. I want a lot of photographs to be characterized at this level. So if we're, to get that kind of buy-in, you can't say, well, do the XRF of the highlights. That's really important to do on a case-by-case basis. But I think the statistical modeling and these glyphs and all of that, what that can do is help surface issues that maybe do merit this really tightly focused, narrow, throw the kitchen sink at it research agenda. Like, wait, this is an anomaly. We need to figure out what's going on here. And so that's when you do the XRF and the Raman and the fiber analysis and all of that. Or here's a big band of things that are the same, and we know nothing about it. So let's take a few samples from within that band of sameness so we understand what's going on there. So it's a little bit of kind of this data-driven approach to understand where analysis might be better focused. Sorry, that was a big drift from your initial comment. Sorry. Okay, I think I have officially used up all the oxygen in the room, and it's getting to dangerous levels now. Again, thanks very, very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.